record. Okay. Now we're, yeah, before we begin our deep dive into the text and have our great discussions, just to give you a sense of the growing bibliographic record of Derrida's works, this is the Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy, which I sometimes turn to. I know it may not be definitive for some people. The University of Chicago Press is busy in a series with 6 editors who are scholars of Derrida to go back to his first years of teaching in the early 60s and try to find all the unpublished lectures or amalgamate the notes from the lectures to then produce texts. So some are just unpublished manuscripts, some are just transcriptions of lectures, but so that's ongoing, and that's been the case for a while. Derrida died in 2004. We're starting with the first published work of 1962, The Origin of Geometry, the translation of the long introduction. But if you can see, I don't know if my screen is sharing it, but the bibliography from the Stanford entry, this is the list, not chronologically, of what's been published in French. I don't have that kind of ability to quickly tell you how many are on there. Some people can count quickly, but I'm going to guess it's a lot. 20, 30, 40 volumes. Same with the English translations. So presumably there's some French text that can still be translated. And I don't want to speak inaccurately, but I believe there's an archival effort in Princeton, and then his own founding of the Institute of Philosophy in Paris itself, which is being run. Others may know more. And then my alma mater, where I studied with him at UC Irvine, Critical Theory Institute, also had an archive. So, for us to do this painstaking, this is a long way of saying it, for us to do a painstaking reading of the first published work when we're staring at, what am I trying to say here? This is an impossible task. So I hope we can all agree that we're still okay with doing this kind of slow moving, kind of section by section, chapter by chapter. And when we meet, we can only really discuss a few paragraphs at a time, which we'll do today. So I hope that it's still a worthy effort for you. This is kind of how I work. In many respects, I think that's the tradition that he kind of started himself. Of course, his contemporaries as well engaged in various ways, but to just stay with oftentimes one text and just really one paragraph or a few lines within the text. Okay, so what I want to do quickly is take us to, well, I usually do the Derrida text first, and then move to Being in Time, Heidegger. I think today we're going to be spending more time with Heidegger for one reason. This section 5 that we just did, and if you didn't and you want to do it, it is, people argue, okay, where in the introduction, which of those sections in the 2 parts of the introduction do we get kind of like a basic statement of what's going on in this whole work? Like how can I get a summary of his thesis or his problematic, and also his foreshadowing of the incompletion of the work? So I don't have to read the whole thing. I can just get it right there and then be able to tell people, okay, this is what's going on. Well, I mean, some could argue that section 5 makes a good case of laying kind of everything out. And also, he himself telling you at the very beginning that this is going to be an incomplete effort, but there are necessary reasons for that, which then shapes the fate of continental philosophy in the 20th century. Okay, so and it's interesting because here we're looking at the beginning of Derrida's efforts, and is this too a kind of foreclosure of what will eventually be stated, the tradition, the problem of the closure, the ontological basis in metaphysics, the difference of being and beings as forgotten, as Heidegger says. And it's through that forgetfulness that we get this tradition that we're then trying to deconstruct, but there's no leaving it per se, or just coming up with something brand new, or just making up our own words and living in a fake language of some kind and just pretending like we're saying something profound. But that doesn't mean that we can't something's still not arriving to us, and we can be attuned to what can be different to shake the grounds a bit, desedimentize, and let things appear in ways that challenge everything that we want to do and think about anything. So a type of freedom in many respects, even though it seems like we're trapped. So this here in this last paragraph, I mean, in a way, we're getting a sense of what Harry's really struggling to, I guess, get out of his use of words that we only know and can use, like the word history itself, histoire. Questions of this kind might seriously impugn the whole originality of this attempt in reading this last paragraph, but it seems they remain outside Husserl's intentions. Undoubtedly, there is not in this account at least a grain of history if we understand by that the factual content of development. Again, empirical history, us sitting here. I don't want to reduce the history of science and history of mathematics, but if you're going to assume that the geometrical theorems that were first created, they stand the test of time, they're internally coherent within mathematics, we can do a proof of them, kids can relearn them, they're indisputable, and it's just that aha moment as a kid, like, wow, I can really trace the steps to get this full-blown proof of this thing being what it is. And for Derrida, that's, if you want to extrapolate, that's almost as an ideality first in mathematics and geometry, then becomes the basis of science. And anyone who thinks the project of philosophy is that too, in some way, to define things and to get some kind of account of what things are. Maybe that's a simplistic view of philosophy. It's not fair to the analytics. Tradition itself, like why do we even have a tradition? Like why do we have to just say, okay, this is what it is and this is how this is unchangeable? So you're not going to get some empirical account of that first breakthrough that when we're sitting on this side. And it's not just that regressive, recursive sense of what could have been prior as the sedimentations that gave rise, not through a subject or an ego, the first geometer, as he says, the first genius, but even this kind of naive sense of the prior before the origin, because we're on this side saying, hey, it'd be cool to suspend even how we feel about that reception of the geometric truth and see something other that we can't name or represent, this arche, that had to be there first for this to occur. And even before Foucault's genealogies and archaeologists start, Derrida is already kind of deconstructing the temporality of that by saying it's not so much just the mystery of the origin of how the first thing came, because this thing arose out of history. It didn't come from God, the geometric proofs, or somewhere else. It just arose from it. But that's exactly what we're trying to suspend is that time of temporalization. It can be different for Derrida, for Heidegger, excuse me. And we haven't gotten to the difference ideas yet. At least not in this text. It'll come. So no empirical history and the temporality of that, either it's chronological historical time or what we think is our historical present, what we think is the origin. I like this. But the necessity of destruction has been justified at the outset, and the annoyed letdown of those who expect Husserl to tell them what really happened. How did it come about? Tell them a story. Can be sharp and easily imaginable. However, this disappointment, he's making fun here, is illegitimate. Look at this. Husserl only wished to decipher in advance the text hidden under every empirical story about which we would be curious. Wow. Text hidden. The suspension. These are hard things to understand because we have to not be in time, not in history, certainly not some kind of unified subject or self. And to take a little detour for our Lacanians, that the breakthrough there, great, which was structural linguistics for him, and almost reinventing the basic foundations of Freudian psychoanalysis. But we're not going to busy ourselves with the unconscious in dreams. I mean, we are, but that's not the project by itself. When we're asleep, we have our dreams and we figure out the repression, sublimation, the libido, the instincts, and how our subjectivity is fraught. I don't want to reduce Freud, but very complex problem with the subject itself between ego, superego, id. But Lacan is working at the conscious level. It did too with this whole sense of self and body and the signification process between the alignment of a signifier and a signified in signs, this tripartite imaginary symbolic real, the unsettling idea that we're not just the mirror image, we have this unified sense of self. It's like an illusion. The prematurity of our birth, as he says in the mirror stage. mapped to the traditional psychoanalytic registers about having a unified body, presumably with a mother. So a lot of this happens even at the level of consciousness about being in history, you can say, for Derrida, that the whole idea that something like this can arise as a unified sense is is the spark of curiosity. It's not being skeptical or relativistic, disputing the truths of mathematics. That's not the point. As we've always said, they're busy doing their thing. No one's going to take them out of their world and tell them, "Hey, you're foolish. You're not going to. You're not even doing anything." It's extremely disrespectful thing to think that. That's not the point. What's scary is that they're doing it. It's happening. What is the nature of this happening? And we got that in an earlier statement about scientific activity. See, but to get to this hidden text that makes that possible, factual history can then be given free rein, no matter what its style, its method, or its philosophy. It will always more or less naively suppose the possibility and necessity of the interconnections described by Husserl. Undoubtedly, these interconnections are always marked by a theoretical and transcendental signification, but they refer to concrete acts lived in a unique system of instituted implications, in a system that has been originally produced only once, that remains de facto de jure irreversible. So you've got this problem of the transcendental signification, the eternal structures of these propositions that seem to be above history. They didn't come out of nowhere. They came through concrete acts. We are living it now in this unique system that was given to us, the ratio, the logos. Let's just assume we're talking about the West here. Um, you know, both Western metaphysics, philosophy, the early beginnings of Western math, and the Greeks. So we're all instituted in that. It happened once. There are 10,000 different Greek origins, throughout 10 million years of history. In Aristotle's physics, he's a funny guy too. He is, and he's in his aporias of time and the now, which Derrida will exploit. He goes, the now doesn't make up the points of time. He's going to deconstruct that Aristotle. But we have to assume some kind of succession. It's the aporia of it not just being that, but if we didn't have it, the events from 10,000 years ago would be happening now. And he's referring to Troy, I think, and the Trojan Wars versus his time. So that's also precisely the point, the simultaneous succession of the acts that we have to relive that made us, but we're also questioning that. And we're also going to question the origin itself that gave rise to it. It's a strange temporalization that you're going to see and how we understand it. The interconnections, what is in the full sense of the word, history itself. Oh, here we go. Okay, now you're making this signified history and its temporal mystery the thing that you want to question. Not so much you want to question historical events that happened and deny them like skeptics might want to do. Oh, that didn't happen. Go into conspiracy theory. Who killed Kennedy? That's not what we're talking about. It's this epoche, suspension, reduction, bracketing, like the history. And he's going to say a lot here. The confronting what is through and through an historical adventure, the fact of which is irreplaceable. We got this tradition. We're committed to it. If you want to fast forward, people can weaponize, obviously, science and the academy and truth production for all kinds of nefarious things. Look at our world now. It's pure hell. What's happening? The confronting of what is through historical venture and a priori and eidetic reading and discourse should be possible. Husserl did not invent such possibility. This whole project of phenomenology and reduction and questioning the origins. It was simply discloses what implicitly has always conditioned the existence of the ideal objects of a pure science, and thus of a pure tradition. Look at this, and consequently a pure historicity, the model of history in general. Later on in the order of things in 1966, the last part of Foucault's text, Foucault talks about a discontinuity of the organizations of what would later become linguistics, political economy, the life sciences, history as an academic field now, the modern sense, had these precursors that are discontinuous in the 1600s. And then by the late 19th century, you get something else, which is our modern age. And history is an academic field, both the historian in the present, the historical object of the past, the narrative, historiography, the tools and method, all that stuff. He says that has a historicity. And you can scratch your head and say, are you saying that there was no the Aristotle problem? There was never 5,000 years ago. And it all began just 100, 1960, 70, 80 years ago. No, he's not saying that. He's saying the whole way in which we do things is itself a buried, something gave rise. The genealogy is prior to what our linear historical time narrative is. And of course, that can change too. Derrida is going to take it one step further by this use of the word historicity. You say the historicity, not the origin of history empirically, and not just the origin of the idea of it, because you can say the late 18th century historicism, or even Hegel, our friend Hegel, philosophy of history, 1830. Prehistory, the whole non-West, sorry to the non-West, today many would avowedly call that his Eurocentric racist inclination. But pre-Greco-Roman, everything else is prehistory, and of course, original history, which is the pursuit of truth, and also historical reflection and awareness, and then the teleological structure that's put into place for some kind of progress. And the reflective could be Gibbons and the English, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the British historian in the 1600s. At least by then, you get this kind of reflective sense of epochs changing as opposed to just living out history occurring, like Herodotus. And then for him, the post-Lutheran German idealist, that's going to be the culmination, the actualization of spirit as the reconciliation of individual freedom with the sense of, the pure culmination that should be from all those dialectical contradictions in the past. So this is not philosophy of history. This isn't Foucault. This isn't, I think the reason why we're trying to juxtapose this reading of Derrida with Being in Time is because you're going to see very strangely some, again, maybe unintended resemblances that you get in 1927, especially when we get to the sections on historicality and temporality and historizing, Geschehen, Geschichtlichkeit, history, Historicität, in the German side of Heidegger. But what do we have here? Pure interconnections of history, a priori thought of history, not the historical a priori, as Foucault would say, conditions of possibility that make things happen in discourse and perception that can then shift without questioning that ground. Derrida is going to question the ground. Does this not mean that these possibilities are not in themselves historical? So you kind of got a circle going on here. Not at all. Remember, Heidegger said no, and we're going to get back to Heidegger soon about his circle. He's like, nope, not a circle. For they are nothing but the possibilities of the appearance of history as such, outside which there is nothing. Okay. History History itself establishes the possibility of its own appearance. There's a doubling going on here. It's very hard to work through, but if we can just for a moment, just before Derrida, just leave aside what Marxists were saying, what positivists were saying, anyone who has a linear conception that's progressive towards something, some teleological end of history, eschatological, just get rid of all those. And also get rid of hermeneutics. Dilthey, we're the subject made from history who then shapes history, both by reflecting it and producing it. We're made by it and we're producing it. Or we're free to be determined and we're determined to be free. So he's going to break these cycles. Let's quickly shift to what's going to be a very hard pivot, because I know I'm ending abruptly there, but just it's important to differentiate Derrida from all those typical registers, the philosophy of history, Marxist history, even Foucault's The Temporal Finitude of History, Historicity of History. Let's see, although Heidegger, we're going to get to that section 6 with his notion of destroying the history of ontology. How is he, in a way, how is his work in section 5, which launches the second chapter of the introduction? So we got the first 4 sections that we went through, and now we're getting to this section 5. As I mentioned, some people might think this is where you kind of, it's hard to dispute this, but you kind of get whatever you're seeing in the table of contents. Part 1, time as a horizon for understanding being, and Dasein's interpretation, it's being interpreted as temporality. It's, again, stated here, but it's not a circle. So just to recapitulate, he's not doing fundamental ontology. He's not saying, hey, there's the question of being, and I'm going to go answer it. I'm going to say it's something. It's the Christian nationalist, bizarre justification for the Trump administration, everything it's doing right now, especially through the wars. Just giving an example. So it's not some bizarre foundational ideological justification for everything and the movement of history. So he doesn't, there is no fundamental ontology. He's not assuming it. There's going to be this weird ontico-ontological, pre-ontological dance that's going on. Don't even worry about Dasein and the analytic. He's just saying, look, we're formulating this question. It's been formulated many times before. Nobody seems to be concerned about the fact that we don't really know if we put the question correctly. We're not even perplexed by it. Remember that? Maybe we're unable to be perplexed. What's going on? It's modernity, and it sucks living now compared to the ancient Greeks. At least they had a spark. They themselves did something in a way of trying to reduce metaphysics to presence, which went a question, and therefore they too may have started something, but it's been leveled. Can we appropriate them positively and do it anew? So we're focusing on formulating the question. You have to assume that someone is the inquirer here. So they're implicated in this formulation. So maybe we need to know more about them. My coffee cup is not formulating the question. So presumably we human beings, this is who we are. What's closest to us, which is ourselves, most immediate, but which is also furthest from us. And he's going to go through great lengths here to say, if you recall previous section, yeah, Dasein's ontic, this entity that's going to be posing a question that has already predisposed an understanding of being within it, because it's in the world, not like just on Earth right now, doing and acting like subjects, but it has the world, the clearness of what's there for itself, and it is that clearness, clear. So you'll see. So it looks ontical, but it's actually unique compared to any other entity. He's going to argue because it's ontological. So, come on, Heidegger. Analytics will tear you apart. You're trying to have it. Is it ontological? It's ontologically onto? Come on, to quit playing games. Be clear here. But he's saying, that's the point. Don't just assume the ready at hand, present at hand. He's going to get to that. It's not just like an entity in the world. It's part of the formulating the question. It's closest to us, but furthest from us. He brings up the world, the kind of being which belongs to Dasein, is rather such that in understanding its own being, as the inquirer is going to pose the question of the meaning of being, it has a tendency to do so in terms of that entity towards which it comports itself proximately in a way which is essentially constant in terms of the world. In Dasein itself, and therefore in its own understanding of being, the way the world is understood is, as we shall show, reflected back ontologically upon the way in which Dasein itself gets interpreted. Wow, that's a lot. So the understanding of being is built into it. It comports itself to the question. That becomes its world. Don't just think of the earth or living physically in the world, but a world, the world of being Dasein as the one that is responsible for this question. But here's the takeaway before you just jump into any kind of science, human science, social science, and psychology, anthropology, and everything else to go about trying to understand what it means for us to even be in the world, what it means to be. Um, because Dasein is ontological prior, its own specific state of being, if we understand this in the sense of Dasein's categorical structural, remains concealed from it. Dasein is ontically closest to itself and ontologically farthest. But pre-ontologically, it's surely not a stranger. See, that's great. That's like an aporia. Lacanian consciousness, too, if you want to take that route. It's not just about the unconscious and what's buried there in the past and how it comes out. Let's just make right now the conscious state itself and all the presumptions about it. Well, that's the uncanny thing we need to analyze. It's closest to us, but we're the furthest from it. Closest meaning, and don't think of that as personal identity, or we're going to get to that. If you think like, okay, it's the most immediate things I got to care about. Like I got an itch right here, or in a couple hours I got to go do something. Or yourself, or the how does the I arise, like it does for Kant, and accompany all of our perceptions? What's the substrate that allows to maintain it, even though it's the one that can intuit its own relationship to time through anticipations and protections? It's got to keep something in place for representation of anything to be generated from this machine, this transcendental machine. Okay, but what I want to get to, I'll have to fast forward quickly here because what I want to do is get to the crux here. Let me Dasein, understanding of being built into it. Dasein is basic state in the world. He's going to talk about everydayness and averageness, but he's going to make that extremely weird and uncanny. But the punchline that's coming is Dasein's being has to have meaning too. Posing the question of meaning of being, Dasein the inquirer, analytic of what this thing is, being in the world. But the meaning of that thing, temporality. Back to the circle. Time is a rise from understanding being. The meaning of being is Dasein. Of Dasein is temporality, but that's racing ahead. You may be inclined to think, okay, well, there's existentialism in the 20th century. That's the two L's, which is not the existential analytic. You might want to go down the path of all these other fields, but those all presuppose something prior. There's a pre-comprehension, pre-already being in the world before all those things happen. There are those sedimentations before Husserl, before even that ingenious, oh no, is that first genius. He's the one that came up with the great geometric proof. And then he's like a godlike figure. And then, we got to obey that. That's our tradition. No, we got to understand, got to unsettle that idea of the origin. Try to understand what the movement is in the sedimentation that made that possible without reducing that to some kind of empirical story or history. So here, similarly, we got I think you should suspend pre-ontological, ontological, ontical priority, ontic, but uniquely ontic in the sense that it's ontological. Ontology is not a full sense of meaning of being because we don't have an answer for that. It's not God. It's not any other metaphysical concept, spirit. It's not the U.S., United States of America, trying to be a new empire in a stupid way. And it's not even right now, 2026, whatever the hell is happening in the world, which is all bad for me. So, we're still not there. He's going to tell you that we don't even have, first of all, we don't have the meaning of Dasein's being, even though that's when posing the question of meaning of being. We don't have an answer to the question of being. There's no fundamental ontology. Dasein here, part one, two divisions, bunch of stuff we're going to learn about Dasein. It's not a human subject. And that's one of its manifestations, and that's what would seem like the closest thing to us. But it's the furthest because we don't want to settle on a metaphysical conception of that human. He'll say that in the letter on humanism too. It's irreducible. It's singular. You'll see in a second. Radical individuation is not just being a unique individual and the most unique, special individual on earth. It's not messianic. It's not chirological or Christological or hypostatic, the God man of Christianity. as a unique proclamation, revelation. But it could be the most essential way we can authentically get back to the question of what we are without assuming anything. But at least we're posing the question, and that's random thinking, right? What else is philosophy? Okay. This is a roundabout way of saying, without reproducing any kind of circle, that the reason why this analytic of Dasein must remain our first requirement in the question of being, which means, okay, well, this is what we're going to start with, because at least we're going to be committed to this separation. Everything else is an optic science. This is something ontological. It obviously involves the question of being, but it's one way of saying I'm not going to do the subject object. I'm not going to assume I'm a subject. I can question the structures of those subjectivity. That's traditional phenomenology. It's not this post-Kantian thing, or it's Alphaben into something like Hegel's system. So you're not really starting with the subject. It's not even part of the Cartesian tradition. And then the job is to figure out either how do I connect to the objective world, generate my knowledge and representations? How am I a part of that? How am I related to it? How is that part of some whole? That's traditional philosophy. That's not what we mean by Dasein. Put it negatively, we have no right to resort to dogmatic constructions and apply just any idea of being and actuality to this entity, no matter how self-evident that idea may be. Being a human being, being a father. I'm not trying to make light of that, especially since I am one and I have my responsibilities. But self-evidence is the last thing we want. Nor many of the categories, that's his neo-Kantian age that he's living in, which such an idea prescribes, be forced upon Dasein without proper ontological consideration. We're always going back to the pre-ontological, pre-comprehension, the bareness of the there, and how does that get cleared for us so we can even be that person asking or doing anything. And it's very uncanny. I mean, I'll give us some examples, but especially when we get to time. We must rather choose such a way of access and such a kind of interpretation that this entity can show itself in itself and from itself. And this means that it is shown to be, as it is approximately for the most part, in its average everydayness. The two components from here are the fallenness into this inauthenticity. How are we going to come back from that for the authenticity? But also for his tripartite structures of temporality. We're already in pastness. We anticipate, that's our resolve to just, as long as we're living, we got a bunch of possibilities, we got to do a bunch of things, but all of those are fake because I'm just going to repeat the falling into the things I normally take up. There's got to be something that's appropriately for me. How's that going to be disclosed to me so I can be myself? And then I'm alongside things constantly. I'm busy. I'm doing. I got these objects on this computer, and that's just being present. So those are the three temporal ecstasies. But this notion of being thrown and already in. Um, is that what he means by everydayness? Okay. It's not just flowing through the day and doing all my activities. It's when you just stop for a moment. You almost freeze like a zombie. You're in the middle of your day and you're doing things. You're like, holy crap, is this really? How do I know I'm not dead? Because a funny piece in the Madness and Civilization about a patient who thought he was dead, clinical patient. He goes, I don't need to eat. And so he's starving himself. And so the trick back then, this was in the 19th century, they tricked the patient by taking him to another room where he says, look at all these skeletons and ghosts enjoying this meal. They're dead too, but they're eating. And that's how they got him to eat. So, I mean, I raise that because, that's humorous, but the issue is you can do that. You can shake yourself from even the flow for a second and just say, the Cartesian moment of saying, dude, is this really happening? But then there's a disjunction between who's asking that question and who's living out that average life. And you're not the one. I mean, you don't want to collapse them too, but it happens. It does happen. That spark, like, damn, nothing makes sense. This is not me. I'm not here. Or parallel universe, maybe. Like, okay, I think I'm here, but maybe I'm over there, really. But imagine not space and everydayness and what's going on in the world. This is going to come back to time very quickly. How do I know that I'm even present versus this pastness and anticipating? Okay, here's where I'm just going to go through these last couple of sections here. They're so critical, and I think it's important we separate to understand the Derridean historicity and his kind of early deconstruction of what phenomenology should be doing and what's going on with Heidegger. But this is the scholars may want to like quickly take all this and bring it back to the tradition and say, well, look, here's what he does with Kant on some issues. Um, Here's the problem in Aristotle's physics about time. And that work is done. Here's what's going on with medieval Christianity. First of all, Augustine, like before then, but certainly by the Middle Ages, and his deconstruction of that kind of scholastic sense. Here's his weird, I don't know how to put this, embeddedness in his Protestant theological exposures as a Catholic raised person, breaking from that, but then the Boltzmann circle in Marburg. Here's the Christian structure. But you know what? He's not doing any of that. There's something so strange and different about this. But here we go. The analytic of Dasein and then setting up the possibility of fundamental ontology, that relationship. What exactly is being said here? Hey, it'd be great if we can do a type of anthropology as philosophical. So you would think he's interested in the human being. After all, anthropology is not zoology or botany. But if our purpose is to make such an anthropology possible, not existentialism in the traditional sense, the nausea of being a modern human being, being as alienated as we are, not the Marxian problem, not the psychoanalytic problem, but the who is responsible for posing the question of the meaning of being and the meaning of that entity that's posing the question, like to put it back in his language. If that's what he means by anthropology, it's not what anthropologists do. They already assume the existence of human beings and they want to study different histories and communities and structures and symbols. It's great, it's interesting, but that's not what he's doing. Uh, if our purpose is to make such an anthropology possible to lay its ontological foundations, our interpretation will provide only some of the pieces, which is all of being in time, division one, division two, even though by no means inessential. Our analysis of Dasein, however, is not only incomplete, in its first instance provisional. This is great. I mean, he's humble, not laying out a whole system from one deduction, not building a system. Provisional, uncertain, subject to change, only has a point for one point in time, or it only has significance for it's an early version. It's contingent. I mean, we have so many, you tell me what your meanings are for that. It merely brings out here's the circle problem, the being of this entity without interpreting its meaning. So far, we've gotten nothing about the meaning of Dasein's being. We've got some things about the world and everyday averageness and the questioner, the inquirer, being there. Fundamental states can be being in the world, but it's not a subject or an I. There's a being with, there's a Dasein with, there's the they, there's being alone, as you'll get when you get to the who of Dasein, who the hell is this thing? It's not Jesus. Um, so the reason it's provisional and incomplete, not fundamental ontology, everybody thinks that is because that is incomplete. This analytic of Dasein, it's only two divisions, there's supposed to be a third. Only got part one. What about everything else? What happens after being in time? It's a rather preparatory procedure, method, path, activity, workmanship, craft. It's a crafting technique, procedure by which the horizon for the most primordial way of interpreting being may be laid bare. So, what is that primordial horizon? Horizon itself, the preparatory. Once we've arrived, only once we get to that horizon, this preparatory analytic of Dasein, which is all being in time, will have to be repeated on a higher and authentically ontological basis. It's almost like he's saying, look, I'm only going to do so much in this book. And if I can do this, then I can get to this, what I really want to get to, the higher ontological basis. Well, it's going to be that the ontological basis of, or the ontology of being, and trying to answer that is going to be, what does he say in the next line? Time. And that's also in the table of contents. It's in the title. We got being, maybe we got a little bit of the and, but we don't have time. And maybe we have even being in time, but we don't have time. We shall point to temporality as the meaning of the being of that entity, which we call Dasein. The first paragraph said, okay, we're going to bring out this being of this entity, Dasein. It's so fundamental to set up fundamental ontology, but we haven't interpreted its meaning. We may be able to get to that once we get to the horizon, but then it has to be repeated. And yes, by the time you get to division 2, you're going to get 10 pages in section 65 on temporality, a whole chapter 4 on temporality and everydayness. But honestly, folks, it's just a couple of paragraphs on the schematic relationships between static temporality. And then time and history again, but more about the problem of movement and back like Derrida, back to this relationship to something primordial that makes our sense of history possible. Those that pick up the Nazi question, the vote, the destiny, the superior power in writing 6 years prior, but also this tumultuous time for him. There's the debate about that, or there's just a straight up debate on what is he getting at with this ontology of history. And then chapter 6, what does it mean to be in time, and how do we date things, and how do things have significance? Time itself becomes a problem again through questioning Aristotle. It's the numbering that goes on in the counting movement, but you need something like time, even though it's not a thing, you'll never know what it is. And then, eventually the clash with Hegel, which I spent my life trying to set everything up to undo that clash and do it properly, because it was too quick, too short, and for a lot of people, perhaps inaccurate. But that doesn't make the Heideggerian project fundamentally wrong. It's just got to fix that point and keep continuing. Get to that higher and authentically ontological basis. Get past Dasein, get past being in time. All we talk about is that. If temporality is the meaning of the being of that entity, Dasein, the formulator of the question of the meaning of being, if you want to put all that into Dasein, as opposed to simply being there, temporality is not going to be being in time or linear time, as we'll see. If this is to be demonstrated, those structures of Dasein which we shall provisionally exhibit must be interpreted over and again as modes of temporality. The coming, future is not tomorrow, but it's arriving. The possibility of my no longer being in the world dead. Anticipate that I'm living it out. It's that uncanny sense of I'm living. This is not me. Yeah, I'm 55. I was born 1971. Hopefully I won't die in the next few seconds, but that's going to come. Nobody wants to be in 2026 since the world is burning down, and I'm not nostalgic. I can't go back to a fun time or race ahead, like to a happier time. I got to deal with this now, but I'm not going to flee from it. I'm not bogged down by it. This is not psychology about anxiety and fear. I care. But it's that uncanniness of being outside myself, flowing in through this body and this time and this sense. I have my commitments, which I don't want to minimize. Like I said, being a father, being a teacher, paying my bills. But this is not it. Something is off here. And I got to come back from that fallenness into what I think to get back to being that ultimately responsible, not just for the meaning of myself. What do I mean? And what is this life for meant? what's going to be on my tombstone. Not that I want to be remembered as a great person, but let's say some of my values are at least someone can say, look, he was at least trying to be a good person. That's, kind of my goal at this age, but nothing else. But, those are still ontic registers. There's something far more uncanny, as you'll see, especially if you're going to say temporality is the meaning of this being. The question is why? Why is that the case? Interpreting Dasein as temporality, however, we shall not give the answer to our leading question as to the meaning of being. You're not going to get the answer, folks. This is kind of cool. I mean, he's saying this in the beginning. When we get to the end of the introduction, he's going to say something interesting. He's going to say, wow, Plato and Aristotle, those guys, they posed a question. They did it kind of like in a primitive way, and they had the resources of their language as if it's innately metaphysical to pose the question and try to answer it. And that's the breakthrough. That's the beginning. Our powers are less than them. We're not big guys like them. He's kind of like a cop. He's like cop out, or is he patronizing? And he's saying those primitives they didn't even pose the question and with its due complexity. I'm going to recreate the question, but my powers of cognition and language are not going to allow me to get to where I need to be. So he's also opting out there too. But here you get it. This doesn't tell us anything. Dasein is temporality, even those whatever analysis we get about temporality here, which is not linear time, whether now points are calendar time or chronological time. It's not as we'll see in the next page. All the different registers of temporality take Zeitlichkeit for the English translators. But we're not going to get to answering this question, but the ground will be prepared for the possibility. The groundwork for metaphysics. Kant makes this big critique, the big shift, the Copernican revolution, but he's not done either. He's laying the groundwork. But at least you can't, as he says, try to answer the questions of metaphysics, but you can't evade me now that I've put these restrictions on what works, what doesn't work with our reason to be able to do what we can do. So the ground will be prepared. What ground? Okay, so what is he talking about? This is the last page here. Sorry. Two more paragraphs. This page and the paragraph at the end I want to show. Okay, this paragraph, we have already intimated that Dasein has a pre-ontological being as its ontically constitutive state. You might be inclined to think, again, entity in the world. I'm living. I'm not dead. I have a body. My hand's moving. I'm awake. All these common things. I'm not sleeping right now. I'm not dreaming. Does that make me ontically constitutive, at least in this present moment? But if I'm not going to even reflect on what makes all that possible from some kind of pre-ontological sense of that, and I'm nowhere near answering the question of meaning of being, I can't presume that either for myself, for you, or the world, or whoever. We want to take down all the systems of authority for the true Derridians in us. All the leaders of the world, the elite, the rich, all the heads of whatever, all the hypocrites, and anyone and everyone who has power over us. So, but Dasein is, just like the analytic is incomplete, provisional. You're not going to get the meaning of being. You're not even going to get to the meaning of Dasein's being as temporality, really. But the ground is going to be laid if we get to that horizon. Dasein is, therefore, also in such a way, will be, as long as it's incomplete, something which understands something like being, but the understanding won't be complete. Keeping this interconnection firmly in mind, we shall show that whenever Dasein tacitly understands and interprets something like being, not beings in the world, including itself, it does so with time as its standpoint. Time, that annoying thing. We know what it is when we don't, and when we don't, we have a sense of what it is. The Augustinian circle. Or sorry, time is when it isn't, or isn't when it is. And then the problems with Hegel and the dialectics of that. Nietzsche, his critique of Nietzsche, later volumes, trying to stamp being onto becoming, the being of becoming, the paradox of the eternal return. Is it that time are we talking about? Or is Heidegger up to even something so bizarre and beyond all those other registers? Time must be brought to light and genuinely conceived? Are you crazy? You're gonna create a metaphysical concept. You're the one destroying metaphysics. You can't come up with a concept of that. You said Nietzsche tried to do that. He's just inverting Platonism. He's the last metaphysician. Let's give him his. Just read him and see what he says. But as a horizon for all understanding, conceived as the horizon for all understanding of being, and for any way of interpreting it, that could be like everything, anything that presumably has an understanding of being, whatever being is, the isness of the is. Time has to be the horizon. Time needs to be explicated primordially as a horizon for understanding being, and in terms of temporality as the being of Dasein, which understands being. You see that mouthful circle? Time needs to be explicated primordially as the horizon for understanding being. The word time, Zeit, explain. Someone is explicating that. It forms a horizon for understanding being. The terms for this explication is going to be temporality as the being of Dasein, whose job is not to, in this instance, fix a pipe or pour another cup of coffee, but understand being. This task as a whole requires that the conception of time thus obtained shall be distinguished from the way in which it is ordinarily understood. You can say ontological difference, being, not beings, ready to hand tools present at hand, us. Distinguish time, primordially explicated, horizon, understanding of being, temporality, it's being a Dasein, which you're going to see is very weird, ecstatic temporality. That has to be distinguished from ordinarily understood linear time, calendar time, chronological time, different calendars, different religions, historical time, biological time, so zero to average life of humans, whatever it is now, whatever country you're living in, whatever medical and health and vaccines you may have, and nutrition and social determinants of health, as they put it, measurement of average length of life. No, not that time. Biological time. And it's not the philosophical or metaphysical conceptions of time and all the aporias of it. If you think it's something that is, and you want to spatialize it, or going back to Aristotle, he had a lot of problems. The relationship to change can't just be change because change can be fast or slow, but time is always is. Movement, that spatialized the motion or movement of a thing or the movement of a thing in something else. And you can count it. Clocks, hands on the clock. So time is what will be made if you just use it as a counter for that, or something else. As he goes, to give credit to Aristotle. It's like he said, I don't even know if it's something that exists, and if it is, it's scarcely, barely perceptible. This is really hard. I don't know what to do. If you say it's just a succession of now points, he'll give us a bunch of paradoxes about that. Derrida will exploit all this in Lucy and Brandeis, but the now can't just be unified because it also has to limit itself and divide things. So something can be no longer and yet to be. But if it remains itself, how can those things occur? And if those things also are, but they're not supposed to exist, how can they partake of being? All that happens in Aristotle. And here he's saying, no, I can't go down that path. And Bergson equates time with space, which is not simple, but he too, to give him some credit. Or Einstein, 3 dimensions of space, width, length, height, like a box. Put time, attach that, past, present, future, get this nice space time, and all kinds of weird things happen that blow our mind, including time travel, reversibility, slowing your time, relativity of frames. two different times. Someone 1 hour at the black holes, millions of years here on Earth. Wow, that's really funny. That's interesting. No, that's all spatialized thinking. It's fallenness. Okay, here I, I want to kind of wrap up here, but you know, all these other movements, if it's science, if you want to go back to Derrida, Husserl, and geometry, is it religion? They have some complicated ideas too, well, not just eschatological models, but the beautiful registers in the New Testament. If you know anything about that, but his mom, go make some wine at the wedding. We ran out. My time has not yet come. What does this have to do with me? I'm no longer in the world. Time is yet to arrive. It's not for the son or man or the angels to know the time, only the Father. The chirological problem of his registers of temporality and his own temporalization. For theologians, not a simple matter at all, let alone the hypostatic unity of this pre-existent logos of being time and eternal, and also this incarnation, and then the death of death, and the Hegelian kind of attempt to go beyond that. There's so many ways to think of it, maybe as really deep and ontological rather than ontological. Look at all these different registers. Distinctions have been made between temporal entities, natural processes, historical happenings, getting back to the history problem. How about the non-temporal, math, the eternal structures, spatial, numerical, timeless meaning of propositions? This sounds like some early deconstruction. You're like, what? Temporal course of propositional assertions? Maybe that's linguistics, the science of tenses. It's also held the cleavage between temporal entities and the supratemporal, and efforts to make bridge this over, this feeling of the eternal now. How about near-death experiences? But temporal always means being signed in time, inner Zeitigkeit. Where did that come from, the within timeness? Why did that have to happen? I don't know enough about certain other traditions, but I'm fascinated. Like, what about native, spiritual, indigenous? Can you go there? I mean, I can't because I didn't come from within those communities, but is it possible to just not be in time, but be with time, or other registers of relationship between being and time? It's not one of within timeness. But even this being in time is still pretty obscure. The fact remains that time in the sense of being in time functions as a criteria for distinguishing realms of being. But look at this. No one is asked. It's true, and I think he's right. In the Western tradition, no one is asked or troubled to investigate how time has come to have this distinctive ontological function. What is the genesis of this within timeness? And why would the primordial explication of time and temporality give us a clue to how that came about? Or how linear time can be derived from something more primordial or deeper, which he's going to try to do. Has anyone asked whether the authentic ontological relevance, which is possible for it, gets expressed when time is used in so naively ontological a manner? Time has acquired the self-evident ontological function of its own accord, so to speak, but it's done so within the horizon in which it's understood. He's like, wow, this is pretty radical. He's saying I need to get to the question of meaning of being. Time's going to be the horizon. Temporality is the meaning of Dasein. We don't have the meaning of temporality by any means, and we never got it. True time is four-dimensional in 1962. Many things happening in the later Heidegger, but in here, we're not going to get the question of meaning of being, but we're also not going to get his ecstatic temporality. We get a question at the end of the book, not just is time the horizon for understanding being, is time the horizon for being? But we don't get that. It's a question. He's just distinguishing it from what everybody else seems to say about it. And as you notice, he's not saying anything about literature because that could be a complicated space by itself. Later Heidegger for sure will pick up on it. But the central problematic of all ontology, there's no mention in this paragraph, he doesn't say Dasein, is rooted in the phenomenon of time. He's obsessed by this. In the Western tradition, let's be honest here, Book 4 of the Metaphysics, chapter 10 to 14, of the 8 books, whatever, scant reflections in Aristotle, at least there. Metaphysics will get you into substance and motion. Plato, time is a moving image of eternity that you'll deconstruct. And many, the sophists, the Parmenides, and many other places, but not as an explicit problem. Augustine's Confessions, then you can take it down all the way up through the history of philosophy. He's going to destroy all that because you got to repose it. Even the non-temporal, supertemporal are temporal. How's that possible? All this gets temporalized in a certain way, being in time. Think about this, even the idea of timelessness or eternity as infinitely dilated time or no time or the absence. He's going to deconstruct all that. And so will Derrida. Those two, for me, are the two biggest people in the 20th century that put the question of time to the test by trying to perform a type of thinking that doesn't take anything for granted. It's the ultimate suspension. That's what makes it so powerful. So, and here we get back into, I'll begin to end, so to speak, because that's where section 5 ends. But I just want to finish this last paragraph here because it gives us some really explicit definitions, which we then still have to separate, especially from Kant, that people might want to come back to. So I'm just going to read here. Even the non-temporal and supratemporal are temporal. Infinite time, time above physical time, Plotinus, things that are non-temporal, which are still have a rise from a finite temporalization that you just may think that they don't. Christian theology, the parousia, second coming at a time, not in history, not yet anyway, anticipated, but already intuited. Super temporal, the theologians will have a lot to say about that. The bastardization of this idea of what's happening right now, literally believing in something like that. Super temporal, still temporal in their being, but the question is how. And not just by the. But in a positive sense, though, it is one which we must first explain. So how are these things temporal too? In both the pre-philosophical and philosophical usage, the expression temporality has been preempted by the signification moves aside everything else that's come about and how we think and talk about that. It's sort of preempted. We're not going to get to a kind of philosophical understanding of this temporality, especially if you're stuck with the most simple version, which is the now point, which we know doesn't make any sense. Aristotle knew that. What am I in a bubble right now? Is it moving into the past? Is it the future coming in right now? Am I moving into the future and shedding my dead skin like a snake, and that's the past? Is it nothing? Is it timelessness? Or like, oh, it's eternal now? Or am I a mystic that just, okay, I can go beyond linear time and just get to this eternal presence? Nothing against religion and mysticism, but that's that path that remains in silence. It's not articulated. Is it the kairos, the fulfillment of time in Christianity, the setting of the sun? We'll get to section 6 on destruction, but it can't be any of those. Those significations preempt us in many respects. The way in which being and its modes and its characters have their meaning determined primarily in terms of time, here's another day, is what we call its temporal determinateness. Thus, the fundamental ontological task of interpreting being as such works out the temporality of being. This is where a lot of people critique, the real nitty-gritty specialists will say, without really picking up on it, but they could. Because by the time you get to Division 2, he asks about, does time have any being, which was Aristotle's first question. But here he's talking about the temporality of being. Temporality is the horizon for understanding being. Task of interpreting being means, okay, interpreting being, I guess, on the way to getting to the meaning of being, which is how the whole book started, through this particular inquirer, because we got to get to its being, Dasein. That's its being's meaning is temporality. And now we're going to work out the temporality of being, presumably what happens after being in time. Part 2, the books on Kant. He keeps moving along until 1931. Then the whole thing collapses, ends, takes a break. works on Aristotle, back to Hegel, some pre-Socratics, does some Kant, Leibniz, many other things, open classes, becomes the rector, the Nazi rector of Freiburg in 1933. I'm not going to go beyond that, but that what happened to this temporality of being? Oh, well, you get it after being in time. Well, wait a minute. Let me go back to, sorry, I missed that footnote here. Yeah. Just quickly, I'm not going to read this paragraph, but you're not going to get a quick answer. It's not just some free floating result of some kind of method. Um, it Positive character lies in the ancients, but they flatten being to beings. They try to make it present, especially time. Can't do that. Can't make it present to hand. It's something more mysterious. But maybe we have to go back, which is positively retrieve from the tradition what was handed down to us, what he calls the repetition of the heritage. Its almost meaningless answer tells us that concrete ontological research must begin with an investigative inquiry which keeps within the horizon we've laid bare. This is all it can tell us. All right, quick distinction here in this footnote from the translators because it's important, and then we'll end. What is this footnote 3? We shall point to temporality as the meaning of the being of that entity which we call Dasein. And in that page that I just read, interpreting being will be what we call its temporal determinateness. All right, that's all English. What's going on here in the German? Zeitlichkeit, temporality. Look at this. And this is where a lot of debates lead, especially if you want to go down the theological route with Christianity. What is tempting to translate the adjectives zeitlich and the noun Zeitlichkeit by their most obvious English cognates, timely and timeliness? For these translators, this would be misleading. Some people do that. Okay, I don't want linear time. I don't want spatialized time. I want Einstein. I don't want the clock, and I don't want my biological birth and how old I am right now. Just use those as the most familiar. How about timely and timeliness, ethics and morality? It's timely. You got to, at a certain age in a certain society, based on the norms, I got to get married, or I got to do this. I got to, or I can reach a certain age where I become more wise. I'm not attached to material things. I reach a certain sense of enlightenment. Think about Eastern traditions, if you know something about that. I know a little bit, but many, not to reduce them, but complicated views within Buddhism and Hinduism. Finally, timeliness, the moral compunction to act at the right time. Who instantiates that? Nietzsche will have a field day with that. Timeliness, the ripening of the fruit. Hegel's preface, it's in the nature of time it's in the nature of truth to appear in its own time. That's awesome. When time was fulfilled, God sent the Son. This is all misleading. For temporal and temporality, something has a temporal nature. Temporality as the attribution of the possibility of determining the meaning of being to time. Yeah, a lot of those things can creep in, but they say it comes closer when he's discussing these words in their popular senses. But even in this situation, he's using his own special sense. And we're going to get to section 65, which if you want to race ahead, you can try to read it, but that's where he introduces his ecstatic temporality. And it's bizarre, to say the least. I don't, in all my years of trying to read stuff, I never have seen a version of that anywhere listed. Is it a syncretism of many different parts of different things and traditions? Yes, for sure, including the early Husserl on internal time consciousness, Kant on schematism, and some Christian structures about both the Kairos and the Parsia. Heidegger foreshadows that much earlier in his lectures on phenomenology of religion. There's a lot of stuff built into it, but then when it comes out, it's like, okay, I don't even think of those traces. What the hell is this? It's very weird. So that's how we'll get into that later. On the other hand, he occasionally uses the noun temporalitate and the adjective temporal in a sense which he will explain later. We shall call these temporality with the big T and temporal with the big T. What do we have here on this page? Time, for sure, but small t temporality is the being of Dasein, not the big T. Don't know what that is. Nobody wants to talk about linear time. That's what people do inauthentically. We don't care about the meaning of being. Phenomenon of time, rooted in phenomenon of time, and then the temporal determinateness, temporality being. So in conclusion, roundabout way of concluding, if you, it's one thing to try to intertwine being and time and then try to understand their relation. Or just take his definitions and make certain deductions. He gives us some preliminary definitions of all this stuff, like time primordially explicated as a horizon in terms of the temporality of Dasein, the meaning of Dasein's being temporality. But Dasein's being, I thought, is being in the world. It's every average everydayness. I need that to formulate the question of the meaning of being, which I'm not going to be able to answer. It's provisional. Hey, it looks like anthropology, human science, psychology. It looks like us, humans. No, it's not religion. And ironically, everything else talked about time has a temporal basis that's been concealed. And also, presumably anything that is infinite or timeless or infinitely distended as time. Time is the moving image of eternity. Well, we human beings can disappear, but let's say someone invented a clock that can't be destroyed, and that goes on forever. That's all, that can be derived, that has to be derived from something far deeper, the ground. And the scary part is this within timeless. Come on, don't take that away. Kant struggled with that. Didn't he give us a way out? Time's not a thing in itself. It's the a priori intuition we need. It never has empirical content. If you don't have that, come on, the thing that doesn't change in order for change to take place within it, you're not going to be able to do anything. You've got to connect your representations. I'm talking right now. Beginning, ending, middle, narrative, language, Lacan, those who like Lacan, alignment and misalignment between signifier and signified, or Derrida, the signified is going to turn out to be an endlessly deferred signifier that we don't tell ourselves because we got to land on one thing. Oh, yeah, that's what that means. So the onto-theological construction of this West, which looks like this Gentile Greco-Roman root for him, no mention of Judaism, which is unfortunate. We got to bracket that problem. And it's pre-Christian, of course, not Gentile, pre-Greek senses of temporality, which he may reduce if he thinks it's just a biblical kind of statements about the origin of time or some kind of eternal God. That doesn't exist, especially the name A Hasher A I am who I am is I am the one who's becoming. It's the relationship between being and time. There is not as simple as people might make it out to be. There's no pre-existing creator in that tradition. If you want to get into these kind of Kabbalistic and spiritual and mystical senses of the name. Anyway, he won't know that tradition and he's going to reduce that. And of course, we know what happened historically with him specifically in terms of the Nazi question and the anti-Semitism. But he leaves that out. That's a strategic exclusion. You got this Greco-Roman, and when I say Judeo-Christian, I mean his Christian context as this Western crux for him that has to be deconstructed to open up again how the sense of time arose. Derrida, Nussio, and Gramé, in our metaphysical tradition, be it Aristotle or Hegel, Heidegger's reduction of them. Heidegger, you shouldn't have done that. Give them their due. How do you know this authentic time even exists? What if it's never existed? Remember in Monsieur Grammet. But he does say, this is the greatest part of that, showing you Derrida's limit, that nothing other in the West has ever been thought when you think of the immediate intuitions of the word time. If we were to think that other, we can no longer use the word time, but we can't. So that's the Derridean aporia. Okay, so I hope this framing was good. I think what we can do, for those that did read the section 5, or if you want to go back to the Derrida chapter, just tell me I'm wrong. Tell me that I messed this up, that you have a different view. So, not that I want to be right. I'm just, this is too fast. It's too simplistic. This is a weird question. Are you happy with what he tried to say in this section 5? Is he, or what is he saying? He's making the connection now, finally, being in time. Here we go. That's what the book is about.
I read both of these texts last night again and
Great.
as preparation, and it struck me more than in the previous sentence that there is an overlap here between Derrida and Heidegger. I wouldn't say a dialogue because I'm not sure he's explicitly referencing Heidegger here. But and the overlap seems to be with this idea of the everyday of Dasein, and the temporality of that, and the way that Derrida understands historicity and the relationship of the ideal objectivities of geometry to the way in which they arise in the course of everyday instruction and investigation. Now, am I right that that is where you would see a point of contact between the two?
For me, it's not just both inherent Husserlian phenomenology, Heidegger very proximate, made by it, and then Derrida multi-generational, because there's an earlier generation of French phenomenologists. So you had to be shaped by them, like Levinas. Excuse me, Merleau-Ponty's generation. Historicity and temporality. I guess what they both have in common here is this idea of suspension. Epoche is the suspension of the question of time that we are. Heidegger says, who are we? It's weird. Derrida talks about the spiritual. It's an adventure in history. History is the possibility of its own appearing. But, how did we even, not just have, why did human beings originate from, how did life start? And what's the chronological story about that, the sciences? And he's going to take that to the level of meaning and tradition and signification and truth, which is what deconstructs about. So is Heidegger on the ontology of being. But it's the suspendedness. Paul, difference is, okay, it's the event of differentiation, which you don't want to make present because you don't want to start with the original unified now and then split it apart and say, okay, this is the difference, because we're going to question that event of unity. So there's a delay because maybe we receive the difference. We have the capacity to differentiate, but the beginning point and the end point are not stable entities themselves that are ever present. So the whole thing is never present, which is a Heideggerian legacy and language about time. But if you even think of delay as in like, I'm sitting here waiting for the train to come, it's delayed, it's boring, or I'm like you have all been in your time, often delayed in getting my paper in on time, not telling, the publisher. I think I just recorded. Is it that though? The receiver? Is it me? But see, when you get into that temporal enigma of the delay itself, you got a stretchiness, of course, going on, but there's no original starting point. And I think that's the piece there. here Heidegger, at least he uses the word distinguishing. They both seem to be trapped in a kind of circle, but they're breaking the circle, you know. And I think the word historicity for Derrida, what does he say they're distinguishing? Heidegger seems like a very classical person. He's going to archive and categorize into different temporal modes of how these other ideas of temporality or senses of it come about, they're used, why this within timeness, and the temporal determinants of being will help us get to the ground. Derrida can question that, and then from the ground we'll be able to answer the question. But not just what does he say here? Oh, yeah, here's a circle. The whole Heidegger Derrida debate. I know I'm stepping away from what you're witnessing, Paul, which is amazing to see this dialogue. But it's the ontological difference in Heidegger, the unicity of ontology itself as a project, the word being crossed out or otherwise later Heidegger, and Derridean deconstruction having just not even starting with the word being. First of all, they've got erasure and trace and supplement and difference and many other things. But it's this distinguishing the metaphysical conceptions of both time and being, the relationship being and time, the temporal timing of being, the temporality of being, the spatialization of being, spatialization of time, all the history of metaphysics and philosophy, scientists too, and then either the destruction of that, clearing for Heidegger, or the deconstruction of that for Derrida. But at least they have in common a distinguishing. And one wonders if the historicity of history itself for Derrida on this, which is supposed to include everything, the free reign, the adventure. He wouldn't use language like this is all destined to us, sent to us from some origin that has been forgotten, or the passage from that first beginning to another beginning. That's Heidegger's problem. To come back to what was already there but forgotten. Now we gotta get this more complicated, real mystery, which is we're all agonizing about it. We can throw away time, by the way. And I'm not claiming this is Eastern, but there are traditions outside the West. If you can get to that state of nirvana while you're alive, where something like the passage of time doesn't bother you, then great. Or the mystico
Well, they're both
unico.
kinds of presence, aren't they? And
What's that?
they're looking at it from a Derridean perspective, both the sort of supratemporal, the eternal, and the sort of down to earth everydayness. They both involve a kind of presence, and that's what Derrida's critiquing, I think.
And
And I think
he
it's
says that in the
implied in
Husserl. He says that in the origin of geometry. He's going to lay out omnitemporality, supertemporality,
Heidegger.
temporality of historicity, and then eventually he's going to get to his defaults. But yeah, there. I mean, if you're gripped by the question of time, then obviously you care. I mean, I don't want to
Yeah.
race ahead, but in Heidegger, he tells the Roman Latin, ancient Roman Latin poet, I should know the name, but it's this myth of like um, care. Kira gets comes along and says makes a human, and there its part is made from the earth, and then I forget which the gods. So someone gives the flesh and the body and the earth, and someone gives the spirit, and then all three are arguing the person that gave the spirit, the God that gave the spirit, the one who gave the earth, the flesh, and then Kira, the original idea of it, the human, and to get a fourth judge to say, well, okay, at birth, the body is formed, so you get to have that. And after death, spirit, you get to take that one. But care, you have to be concerned about this for the stretch and the allotment. It's one of the earlier versions of care. See, it's about time. If you just flow through time and head towards death, I mean, to simplify being in time, then you can do that very anxiously and constantly be concerned about it and not do anything. That's a possibility for sure. Or you can do what most people do, which is like, I'm not going to think about it now unless I'm really sick and I have a terminal problem, then I'm forced to think about it. Or near death kind of experience, a car crash. And then, wow, I can't believe I survived that. I don't want to reduce those temporal registers. Or I worry about oppression. I mean, I can't imagine the suffering in certain parts of the world and the temporalization, which is beyond me. I'm not going to speak for it because just out of respect for it. So there are ways in there, but for Heidegger, none of this is this is all derivative to this ecstatic structure that's going to link care, guilt, anxiety, being towards death as the greatest possibility to be. That once it occurs, we no longer are. We can't pass through the transition and have an experience of it. It's not near death where we just really die physically and medically tested. We go up to some light, lots of love, come back. Oh, or suddenly come back from the dead and tell people, hey, this is what I saw. That's all spatialized and haunted. Finite temporality is lived. The Kierkegaardian problem, disrelation of the temporal eternal, no. He'll say that. I mean, that's Heidegger saying. He's always saying it's not this, not that, not enough. But at least he's on to the fullness of being as time, as lived, without having an ontic biological birth. And death is anyone. You can see other people die, and you know it's coming for you. You just don't know when. Thief in the night. It's radically singular. Nobody can take its place. It's not relational. It's going to happen, but it's indefinite. Not because we don't know when. We don't know the meaning of the when. Most people, I don't know when it's for me. I mean, I can walk outside and get hit by a truck. I don't know. Hopefully that won't happen. But the my relationship to that is the problem in terms of the temporality. Stop. We'll come back to that. But I saw Sai's hand.
Um, yeah, I think if you look at the context, one of the main problems that he's trying to solve with this being as temporality is the understanding of the traditional ontology, at least in Thomas Aquinas, that being is a combination of essentia and existentia. And what Heidegger feels is that a medieval ontology considers essence to be um, existing independently of existence, and it is prior to existence and atemporal. But when it comes to the notion of Dasein, Heidegger says that we do not have an essence that is independent of existence. Or in other words, being cannot be understood outside of its temporal existence and in Dasein's ecstatic temporality in terms of projecting to the future and as well as confronting its past in terms of facticity. So I think the problem with, I mean, at least what Heidegger tries to solve with being as time is that we must do away with this understanding that medieval ontology had, that there exists an atemporal essence, and then it has being as a predicate in terms of existence. And then, I think what Heidegger is basically trying to do is that he says that we cannot understand essence without existence, and it will be together. Yeah.
That's a great point, Si. But let's remember Heidegger on Aristotle and Aquinas. If Aristotle at least poses the question of substance for the metaphysics, and does that in a very concrete way because it's about thought thinking itself. If there's going to be a science of divine as the highest form of contemplation, because all these other acts of thinking, the Nicomachean ethics, and again the metaphysics, there's going to be a science of the divine. The science itself has to be divine in nature, which is the metaphysics. But substance as the thinking substance of itself, and then very obscure towards the end about this is life and duration, this should be God, whatever God is, not the Judeo-Christian God, but his version of this kind of structure of duration and movement and the metaphysics of it and the contemplation of it. You don't have that centrality of the subject in the existential. Because of Christianity, you're forced to do that, any religion, but yeah. And Christianity is supposed to have an answer for you. But for Aquinas, in the Christological framework of essentia, existence and the essence being fused, you're right, absolutely. But the answer becomes Christological. And I think for Heidegger, as you said, that's not the case. Also for both Aquinas on the commentaries, unless I know he has a commentary on Thessalonians, which would be interesting. And he has, of course, of Old Testament commentaries. But this idea of ecstatic temporality, which may have more of the Eckhart mystical roots compared to the scholastic, as you said, but he doesn't take it up. I mean, he's dealing with the philosophers primarily, especially as we get to Division Two, and he's going to ultimately do battle with Hegel. Time is the concept which is there. It's merely intuited as an a priori, but doesn't have the fullness of the notion. So you got to go from Kant's bare skeletal structures and give it the fullness it needs, but bring it back to Aristotle's problem movement. That's what Hegel's going to do at the end. And somehow Alphaba and this Christian Trinity. But for Heidegger, and Heidegger has to confront that, but you have, remember here he said, look, don't even jump into existential too quickly. So when we say because Sartre will do that for us. And a lot of us may want to say that, look, forget about metaphysical essences. The real mystery is existence. That's essential to the question. In our thrownness as existent is more mysterious than any metaphysical concept or idea. You can create a metaphysics of that suspension of metaphysics, so to speak, is just purely essence and really think its idea's existence. But back here, existentialism with the L can demand an existential analytic if we conceive of philosophical cognition as something possible and necessary. I guess what he's getting at here is that even all the existentials that come out in all these other fields, for example, presupposes this deeper question of when you say something like the essence is existence, or the fusion of them, then what is that? What is being presupposed there? What has to be cleared in terms of that thing being there, what it is, whatever it means to anyone, because it can mean all kinds of things. So yeah, I think, but for me, this problem of time and temporality, given the scant attention to it in the scholarly literature, I know people talk about William Blattner's temporal idealism as the definitive interpretation of both Heidegger and Kant in Division Two. And that settles the matter because that's where Heidegger went right after he went back to Kant. Some of you know me, and I've never. You got to know all that stuff, but I take seriously this problem of this quaternal ground beneath it all, which the later Heidegger will articulate. But Paul, remember the foresight and dissemination? It looks anti-dialectical, anti-three. Time has only been three. Heidegger's equiprimordiality, which he's not going to name here, but the relations of the three, the ground by which they interact. What are you talking about? So we're going after time here, but in a way that's never been done in the history of metaphysics for both of these thinkers.
Yeah. Just a very short.
Yes, please, son.
Sorry.
I'm not
I
Mr.
come in just very shortly.
Yes, and I'm not Mr. I'm Raj. I'll call you sir. You don't call me that. Please.
I just said sorry.
Oh, sorry. I thought you said so. Good. Okay. I'm glad I misunderstood this. Yeah. How arrogant for me to even misperceive that here. I didn't hear it.
No. But thank you for friendliness. Just a very short, what came to my mind, when this opening pages where we come to talk about time, he immediately goes on to say let's say double them with spatial terms. He calls it horizontal. Horizon, taken very simply, is not a temporal word or concept or something we associate, but it is spatial. And there's this always doubles in Heidegger. And on the other hand, from Derrida's side, it's about the explication of geometry. It's about geo, it's about word, but he there comes from the word to historicity, to time, to Geschichtlichkeit. There's always this doublings of space and time, and I think it is a common point between Heidegger and Derrida. Maybe we can keep in mind. I have been always thinking about this, l'espace-monde in Heidegger and in Derrida. So I think that could be another line of thinking together, this time, spacing of time, or temporality as spacement, or referring back to word again.
These are great points, Summit, but let's be careful because he wants to detach time from space. That's his problem with everything else, at least for Heidegger. And you're right, though, but that's the contradiction we can exploit, maybe using Derrida inside. Why are you using the word horizon? Come on, you should use something else. Because you usually think of the horizon as spatial. But spacing, which you'll find in the first definitions of difference, let's say margins of philosophy, but also Monsieur Benet, is the temporalizing of space and spacing of temporality. But here, to be clear, though, if you're going to detach time from space and keep that an open question as to not what it is, but not Aristotle, if in fact it has any other being, and how do we go about describing that without recourse to changing the movement? If you want to get at it for its own mystery, Heidegger is going to question that. But we have to separate not only the time from the space, but the use of the words. The problem with the German is when we get to it, geschehen gets historizing in this English translation, but geschehen is happening. Historizing movement to Bewegung, and that could be ontological movement versus Bewegung, motion, the moving train, internal movement of myself, dying, getting old. That's motion, that's ontic, but the movement is something else. Geschichtlichkeit is the ontological understanding of that, as opposed to Geschichte, which is professional history or story, and Historie, German history with an IE, as story. But you can differentiate all those, just like you have your Zeitlichkeit and then Temporalität. But remember the Derrida registers, he comes back to that history, at least for that chapter, a priori of history, interconnections in Husserl, back and forth, forward movement we got, questioning the origin. Not because we can get to the nonsense, that quote unquote nonsense of elements that we are, in some kind of transcendental Kantian sense, can put together, since we're on this receiving end of the tradition about the origin of that eternal truth that became math and science. And then we get to repeat it. How do I go around and against myself to get to those sediments without using some kind of a priori design? But I guess he gets, in a way, a little confused about not so much the question of how does the eternal structure emerge from history as an arbitrary process, and how do we reflect on it, but I guess what is history itself as a temporal problem, if you think about it? Because it's certainly not what people tell you. It's not just seeing the news telling us, oh, this major event happened, and then someone records it, and then you teach it to kids in school. So this transcendental project here going on, as you rightly noticed, but he uses all kinds of strange things there. And here, horizon, what will become the later Heidegger and the abandonment of all this is just no more philosophy to get answers, but pushing how far thinking can go. The most thought-provoking thing in our thought-provoking age is that we're not thinking. Being in time opens up with that. We just want to be perplexed. You've got to keep thinking. It sounds regressive, thinking about thinking. But it's more of, I guess that's, can you reach the horizon to get to the ground? He'll say this paradoxically too. Ground is kind of spatial, right? The word. Too. Or how about here? Rooted? What do you mean rooted? In the phenomenon of time? See, what Derrida is going to exploit is this poor Heidegger is still stuck in this kind of metaphysical will to present or represent something as being, or as some, even if it's not a thing, because it could be an event, Ignis. And there's none of that in the Derridean dissemination. He can play around with so many different registers. But yeah, if we're going to maintain some fidelity to what these guys want, it's not about the spatialization of time. Because presumably that's the fastest way to bring in our own subjectivity in our mind and our cognition, and that's not what this is about. So I actually try to go back into the depths of the time question, but I don't do it with three in mind. I take seriously the promise to Heidegger's making, and then what Derrida is trying to differentiate from that with his deformants as something the West has never been able to fathom, something other than three. Sai, is that, but Senate, please, is this, tell me, I think you're clearer. You're more convincing because that's what it seems to be saying.
No, I just wanted to like draw our attention to some kind of parallels or some questions that like, is resonating in my mind. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Later on, we can also come up to this point again, I'm sure.
Yes, and it will come up again. I mean, the whole being in the world is making distance vanish, deseparance and closeness and proximity, not to things at our hand, but authentically relating to how we are in the world. Sai, did you want to come in? I thought no. Okay. Oh,
No, I had a question in my mind, but I don't know how to formulate it properly. But with respect to Derrida, when he criticizes Husserl in terms of his distinction that there was an initial originary experience that has now become idealized and then iterated again and again or like transmitted down.
mhm.
Um, I'm sure I'm assuming that Derrida would deny that there could even be such an originary experience that is completely present in terms of its content or meaning. And
Hmm.
maybe I'm saying that Derrida would object to it, saying that even the first originary experience is already an iteration of sorts.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
it's,
Exactly.
yeah.
But its question is, because I thought in that paragraph he says people want that of Husserl. That's not and maybe it's. I mean, if it is Husserl's intention, he thinks he can actually pull this off. Then yes, Derrida would deconstruct that. What would be the arche cannot be just another origin. See, delay can actually, if you want to get past this linear time as irreversible, passes behind us. Here we are, we're going in one direction, future. But the delay can go in two different directions. The delay at the origin, arriving to the origin, is that originary is not. He used to say two before one. Like, what are you talking about? Okay, one is the origin. It's double. That leads to an infinite regression. But yeah, no, you can't. There's never a commitment to an originary presence because that's going back to an originary now, and that the now is just Aristotle will tell you how can it limit and bound itself, play the role of dividing, maintain itself, and if it's going to remain the same in itself before it's dividing into past and future, then it can't be itself. Therefore, it never was. But if it never was, it's already its past. He's gonna. It's amazing, and Derrida knows this. You can't really reduce it. This is bad about Heidegger. I'm with Derrida. He just, at least here and anywhere else, I mean, he just didn't really give it the attention he should have put for the physics. What he does get Aristotle on is Aristotle finally settling on, which becomes classical metaphysics, and therefore math and science's version of time. It's the counting of movement, the number of movement that we count, that allows it, that operates and allows us as beings to then experience the earlier and the later. And then that's what we call time. But yeah, no, I don't know if it's even okay for Husserl to say there's an originary experience of what was before the first geometers and the first proofs. If you say it's discontinuous, then you've romanticized in human genius, which people may want to do. That's okay, I guess. But or do you want to do this, which is to question, like even what he calls a juridical commitment to institutions that form around that iteration. And we want to be free to question. Do folks feel like in the section 5, people ask like, oh, okay, good. Now I get a sense of why the book is called Being in Time. So you don't really get that. Thought about the question of meaning of being, because that's how it opened up. Being and Dasein. The sad thing is that we don't ever hear about time, except 400 pages later for just a few pages. Time doesn't come back at all. And then it disappears again, and then he meets Hegel. Incidentally, can I ask folks if they have a background in Hegel? Because I keep coming back to Hegel. If you don't, and just say no, but would we be willing to add a third text? And we might want to start now, just reading the preface to the phenomenology, because the phenomenology does conclude with that it's in the nature of truth to appear in its own time. And it also, uncanny, the end of this introduction, we'll see in Being Time, concludes with Plato's Parmenides, Aristotle's Metaphysics, and our ancient friend, meaning relative to Heidegger, the Parmenides is the greatest aesthetic achievement of the ancient dialectic, and the ecstatic dreaming one experiences if you move through Aristotle's metaphysics. Those are great giants for Hegel. But, then the but. So, both are kind of coming back to these two pillars for the Western tradition. There must be reasons why. So if we want to do the preface, I'd recommend that. The hard part is that that's also 500 pages, and what really matters for this project is getting to the end, which is absolute knowing. And nobody has been able to explicate that, including Kojev and Hippolyte and on the French side, and then if you go with the German side of the 20th century, Frankfurt School, Dorno. Not from what I've seen, and not the Anglo-Americans either, as much as they may say. He's not destroying time and going back into eternity, let's just put it that way. He's coming up with another conception of time. It just wasn't, he couldn't do it. He couldn't. And Heidegger tries to attack that. So think about it. If you don't want to, we'll just keep moving forward. Any other reflections?
There's an essay by Hippolyte on the preface to the Phenomenology, which was delivered at that conference in Baltimore that Derrida gave his famous talk at.
Oh, on Structure, Sign, and Play, 1967, Hawkins?
Yeah, at the same conference, there's a paper by Hippolyte about the preface to the Phenomenology, which Derrida will later draw on when he writes about prefaces. I think it's in dissemination.
And Hippolyte, the great translator and interpreter of the phenomenology of spirit that taught the young Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, he was the big guy.
And
Kojev taught the 30s, and every big person then attended his lectures, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Lacan. They all got a lot from Kojev, of course, desire, recognition, master slave, and time and eternity. But you're right, Hippolyte, at least by then, some Heidegger and phenomenology on the Husserl side got to. It wouldn't have gotten to Kojev's time so quickly, but by Hippolyte it did. And his interpretation in the genesis and structure of the phenomenology of spirit, getting back to Sai's point about essence and existence, you get a Heideggerian way into Hegel, if you will. That there's something more going on than just the negation of time and the subsumption back into eternity. It's not that simplistic. It's an event-like structure. That's good, because that helps the Derrida generation say, okay, the three H's, as Vincent Descamps said in France, Husserl, Hegel, and Heidegger. And Deleuze says, was defeated by the holy trinity of Deleuze, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. So you can do the Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, or you can do these three. But
you need both.
You need it all. But yeah, for Derrida, you got all of it going on, as you know. So okay, this could be a good breaking point, or if anyone wants to share. Alex, please.
Thank you, Raj. Yeah, I picked up this copy of Genesis and Trace that's helping make this entire process a little bit easier, because Heidegger's, I don't know, taking time out of time is always good, but my German is terrible. So I need the companion text here to really kind of help me parse through it. But I guess, as we're moving through trying to see Husserl's attempt at reduction that doesn't end in extraction. We're trying to maintain like the fidelity of what his project is without giving into the failure points of it, I guess, which is where what Derrida comes in with taking his deconstruction of Husserl's thought on time, right, on temporality and on origin as in general. Um, so I guess I'm trying to understand this Genesis point, and Hegel might be a better bridge on that. That's just
Yeah.
where I'm coming from.
And this is such a contentious problem because as we move through the 60s, we're going to do this chronologically. We're going to get a lot of Husserl, speech and phenomena, and then Bataille and Hegel writing Indifference. Margins is 1972, some more essays on Hegel. But grammatology, if you go back to that ending of the first part there, this trembling between Hegel and all post-Hegelian attempts. Or even the famous Foucault quote, like, oh yeah, we think we can just bash Hegel and he smashed him and he's laid all these traps. Little do you know when you get to where you're trying to get to, he's hiding, he's over there waiting for you. So I don't know, something like that. But the point is that
Sure.
it almost insurmountable, and it's uncanny that being a time crashes on Hegel's phenomenology.
Yeah.
But then the Kantian side will tell you that Hegel also in the phenomenology has to reduce poor Kant and what he's struggling with in both the schematism, the first analogy of the third principle analogy of experience. Time is that which does not change in order for change to take place within it. How can we even coordinate relations and then sort of successive or simultaneous? So for Hegel to like link this up into a conception involving the movement of all those, relationships, how does the whole have all these moves? It's almost like absolute knowing doesn't need the history of philosophy, all the different shapes that he's going to deconstruct. Skepticism, Stoicism, reason, the Enlightenment age and the French Revolution and then art and religion eventually. Those are maybe absolute presentations of spirit. No, they're not. And,
Right.
especially Christianity would be a religion. Absolutely. Boom. But yeah, the obsession, that's the interesting, I think, Heidegger question and Derrida is this sounds very Eurocentric and that these characters are all Gentile. Again, an exclusionary section of Spinoza for the Western canon, but the Greeks up to the German idealists were obsessed with posing the question of being in terms of the question of time. They tried to answer the question of being, and they neglected both the time problem and their relationship. And how is this whole metaphysical thing constructed? Kant does come along and give us a little breaking, but for Heidegger, that's just a start. The quote here, as we'll see, is that it's a secret buried in the soul, which is his problem with the schematism.
Mm-hmm.
Even the unity of the eye, the apperception of having an eye represent all of our representations.
Right. Well, that's going back to presence again.
And the transcendental ego phenomenology. But here, yeah, I think by the time you get to Derrida, even just dispensing with the idea of origins, and his haters came along because it literally sounds like he's saying, let's just discount everything that exists. First of all, any kind of final meaning to a text, or even scarier, like you're saying history doesn't exist. You see the 20th century, you see what's happening now. That's not happening. It sucks. It's terrible. It's like evil. You can't, he's not, I don't know. Maybe we go back to what he says here, this last point here. Maybe we can end with this. Could historicity, pure interconnections of history, a priori thought of history to appear as such for us? For Heidegger, it's about how does datability spanning of epochs, the meaning of history even arise from this primordial temporalization. So it becomes a problem or a question for human beings. But I think here, that's that Heidegger said here, it's if historicity is to size point, not an originary experience that is the first instituting act of what would then become the history of instituting the norms and principles by which others would come along and have their originary experiences and breakthroughs for more eternal truths in math, science, philosophy. So if there's no, like it's like a non-origin to the origin or other than the origin, to use different Derrida registers. But arche, other, don't use linear time like origin if there than something before that. Like the physicists, they're all goofing around with that. No, there's no beginning to the Big Bang, and it's the end of another universe and more multiverse. Or Hawking curve, like, okay, it's like you're never going to get to that origin, but at least it's bounded. So don't worry about something before the Big Bang. They're all spatializing their stuff. That's fine. And we're not talking about the universe. We're talking about something smaller than that, but much bigger. Just everything that claims to be. But history itself establishes the possibility of its own appearing. I think the way we have to come at this is, are we willing to break the circle? Because this all looks like we're being trapped in. Both these guys are just reproducing the circularity. Then the analytics, meaning philosophers, can go after them as if they're confused or they don't even know that they're trapped in a circularity. Paul?
Yeah, I was just applauding the fact that you went back to that fundamental quotation in Derrida. It's very, very important, I think, and apt.
Yeah. And I unfortunately, we didn't even get to see the reduction has to empty. Bracket means you empty out all the primary intuitions, all the signifiers that want to evoke a signified, all those words, and whether a speech is about writing or if you're going to encounter the text. It's not about everybody, but if you think these two things are going to give you some automatic mental object or meaning, a thing that is that's attached to the signifier, instead of seeing that signified as an infinitely deferred set of signified as an infinitely deferred set of signifiers, as traces that are beyond presence and absence, that don't originate from some Big Bang or Genesis 1 in the Bible. Because we're getting back to the problem of time, then to do such a reduction for the concept of history, especially the history of truth, credit to Ricoeur in the 40s. I think Derrida acknowledges him a few times. He was also picking up on this role much earlier than Derrida. But if we can get away from psychological genesis, which is quite a tennis role for doing that too, empirical history, when you say genetic or genesis, Alex, and think of the reduction of these quotations, history establishes the possibility of its own appearing. Well, the history of truth, the history of language, the history of metaphysics, the history of science, all of us human beings, anything that exists, like Heidegger's ontological difference, that's what we're trapped in, right? But the reduction is, it sounds Kantian. What are the conditions of possibility? That's a transcendental leap based on our limits. History is limiting because we're not eternal gods. But then that last line there, history with the big H there, not just because it's the first word in the sentence, establishes possibility for its own appearing is not circular. That's the problem. That means that history, first word, means something else. And Derrida may come up with a bunch of names for it, including deconstruction itself. He's a smart guy. He's not going to remember Paul. He constantly gets asked, "Oh, what does that mean?" Every decade, it's justice. Oh no, it's Marxist. Oh no, what do you mean? It's like I'm gonna suspend myself from your question, so I don't give you the predetermined answer built into the question, even though you naively think that you don't have the question. You think I do, So let's suspend even that term and just let's get going and let's move around. Okay, we're at 10:30 now. And thank you for those who stayed till the end. We have an exciting confluence in 2 weeks, which is the Abbau destruction problem in Heidegger. How's Heidegger going to do some destruction? And its difference in relationship or influence on Derrida's deconstruction. But we're going to be introduced to this idea of destruction, which is not Heidegger blowing up a building at all. but a retrieval and an appropriation, eignen, of all of the traditions in a positive way. But that pre-comprehension of Dasein being thrown in the world is being worked out as the positive appropriator, which requires destroying history that we received to tell us that's what was there. And Heidegger, for his part, can say, no, that's not. We're not just shaped by what those ancients created about us. You're missing something that you don't see them trying to work out. And then the later Heidegger will say the pre-Socratics were even, they're the main guys that Plato and Aristotle then have to kind of flatten out into their systems or structures of logic. So philosophy to thinking, so to speak. But destruction, now it's kind of like, okay, good. The juxtaposition of the two thinkers starts to maybe make some more sense. All right, great discussion, folks. Thank you so much for being a part of the journey again. And is it okay if this lasts forever? Because we'll never get to the end.
Endless deconstruction. Perfect.
Or we'll never get to these books have ends, apparently. I mean, Derrida's quote.
This rate, it would take 2 years, I calculate.
Well, no, these sections are short.
More than that, maybe.
By the way, the origin of geometry, those sections, those later chapters, they're going to be like twice or 3 times the length of some of these earlier ones. And trust me, section 65 is like 10 pages long, and each paragraph is an underdeveloped book. So we're all kind of screwed. I'm sorry.
10 years.
All right, folks. Great seeing everyone. Thank you so much. Great
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Bye.
We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.